Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just very quickly, Chair Nadler, you said 13 hearings, and I know maybe I lost count, but none of them were specifically on this bill?
They were on this bill, yes. In the 116th Congress, in addition to this, we passed this bill in the 116th Congress.
Okay, so before my time.
Right.
So I've never been to a hearing that was specifically on this bill. So this Congress has never dealt with it. Is that the way I'm understanding it?
Yep.
We held those hearings in the 116th Congress, but the bill is substantially the same.
Okay, but there were many of us who weren't here and had no input onto this bill. And I just wanted to clarify that.
Excuse me, I wanted to clarify. You will recall we did have a hearing last week.
On voting rights, not on this bill.
Right.
On many of the issues contained in this bill.
Okay,
yes.
okay. Well, and Mr. Chair, Chair Nadler, I was just trying to make sure I understood exactly because you said 13 hearings and I didn't recall one on this bill.
The bill was introduced 6 days ago.
Thank you. And Ranking Member Jordan, well, I've got your attention. You know, I mentioned that we sat through quite a few. I think there's 6 in the subcommittee that alone that I sit on. And I'm just wondering, you know, do you feel, Ranking Member, that there is a real need for this bill? I mean, are we seeing that there's some dire situation and things that you can point to? I know you kind of mentioned it in your opening, but I guess I'm just, after the kinds of
Well, thank you. Thank you for the question. The chairman just said a few minutes ago that since the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County in 2013, so 8 years ago, he said there's been all kinds of voter suppression acts enacted and everything else. Well, if there have been, they're certainly not working. I mean, here's what the Chief Justice said. Black turnout in the most recent election exceeded white voter turnout in 5 of the 6 states originally covered by the Voting Rights Act. So if there's been all this suppression that previous Democrats speakers have talked about, I'm sure it isn't working very well because we have record turnout, which is, as we've said now multiple times, the ranking member said it, I think all the Republicans, is a good thing. So of course that hasn't happened. I was also amazed by the previous, the gentlelady from Pennsylvania. She said, Republicans have engaged in extreme gerrymandering. And I almost started laughing because she comes from the state where the state Supreme Court, controlled by Democrats, just redrew all the districts in Pennsylvania in the middle of the 10-year cycle. And yet she has the nerve to say, oh, Republicans have engaged in extreme gerrymandering when their state Supreme Court did that. We all know we've had colleagues who were impacted by that. So again, I guess you can say all kinds of things, but it's nice if it's actually backed up by fact. And the fact is, we have record turnout. If there have been voter suppression acts passed in the last 8 years, they sure aren't working very well because record turnout amongst all groups, particularly African Americans, which, as I said, exceeded white turnout in 5 of the 6 states originally covered by the Voting Rights Act.
Thank you, Ranking Member. And Ranking Member, Section 3 of the bill, it creates a retrogression provision. I'm wondering if you could speak to that because it seems like this language is very broad and open-ended.
Right, and the general concern, I think, I appreciate bringing this point up as well. The general concern is this requirement that now to do anything different, you got to get an okay from the federal government. It's going to make it, I think, real. I think the focus is on voter ID, photo ID requirements. Third, I think, is this idea that certain states have a pretty strong photo ID, voter ID requirement. That may be in jeopardy current law. They may have to get the okay from the federal government for what they've been doing, have been doing, and are currently doing. And then finally, the fourth thing I think is all part of this that concerns me is this idea that you're going to have this tally. If you have some liberal interest group that sues your state on some concern about the election law, and you enter into some kind of settlement, some kind of consent decree, that's going to be counted as a mark against you, and it's going to further, you get so many bad marks, we'll call them, you're going to have the Justice Department coming after you as well. So that's all part of this concern I think we have with the legislation, not to mention the main point we made, which is we're just not seeing it. There's record turnout amongst all groups in the country.
And finally, Ranking Member, there is the provisions with the Attorney General and their ability to kind of reach in and before there's even real proof or anything, and I don't know if you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, I was sort of, I guess I said some of that in my previous answer. What also concerns me about, and I think I had this maybe in my opening comments, is this idea that for those states, if you remember when Attorney General Barr left, he said if your state goes back to the law it had pre-pandemic, pre-COVID, you're fine. If you go back to the law that they had been in effect just a year ago and had been working fine and never had a problem, no Justice Department in the Obama administration or the Trump administration had said any concern about it, that was presumed fine. Now the Garland Justice Department and the Biden administration is saying, nope, can't do that. If you're going to go back to where you were just a few months ago, that you're going to have to get the okay from the federal government. Meanwhile, at the same time they're saying that, they're saying we're not going to look at changes you made and whether those adhere to the Constitution or in any way may have violated someone's rights. We're not going to look at those. For example, I look at just the simple fact, Madison, Wisconsin, Dane County went to drop boxes. The legislature didn't pass that. They just decided we're going to have drop boxes during the last election. And now if the legislature says well, we're no longer going to do that in this next election, that could be a concern because the Civil Rights Division, the Justice Department say, oh, that's going to hurt. That's going to be a violation. That could be a concern. When they just did it, the local clerk just made that decision. So that's I think the big problem as well that we have with the legislation.
And then before I yield back, Ranking Member Jordan just wanted to see if there was anything else you wanted to comment on.
No, thank you.
All right, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Ms. Fischbach. Mr. Morelli is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I remember that old phrase, reading is fundamental. Well, when it comes to government, voting is fundamental, it seems to me. I've been listening to this discussion and watched what's happening in this country over the last several months. I'm reminded, I think it was Alice in the Looking Glass, it's curiouser and curiouser. So I think Mr. Jordan said in his opening comments that this was a Democratic power grab. But I do note in Georgia and Arizona, with elections certified by Republicans, you're still trying to figure out how to overturn and audit the 2020 presidential election. Certified by Republicans, no fraud discovered, and yet there are still legions of people in the Republican Party who accuse Democrats of a power grab who won't even acknowledge the outcome of the last presidential election. I'm astonished. Mr. Raskin mentioned, I had written this down, but some of the reprisals that people in states who voted for Joe Biden, apparently they weren't supposed to because it's a free and open election, unless, of course, it goes in a way that you don't want it to. So I was thinking, as Mr. Raskin mentioned it, you know, how it could be a crime to hand someone a bottle of water when they've stood in line for 3 hours to vote, when they're trying desperately to exercise their franchise, which is the most fundamental of rights. Can't think of anything more fundamental than your right to vote. We don't have the right to vote, we don't have a democracy. We don't have a democracy, we don't have an America, certainly not the one I recognize, and the one I always say I took as an article of faith would be here when I was a kid. If someone could explain to me the public policy value in stopping fraud, do people fraudulently show up and stand in line for hours because they want a bottle of water? Is that the fraud that's going on? Is that what we're trying to stop? Someone hands you a candy bar or a granola bar because you've been in line for 5 hours because they took away polling places and made it almost impossible for you to go to, so you stand in line for long hours? That's a crime? I mean, this is a disgrace. It's a disgrace. I also find it curiouser and curiouser that, Mr. Jordan, you would use 2020 data on election participation when you won't even acknowledge the outcome of the same election.
I've acknowledged the outcome of the election.
Have you? Did Joe Biden win this election? There was no fraud? You're prepared to say that?
He's president of the United States.
No, that's not what I asked you. Did he win the election? You said he's the President of the United States. That's only because we were here while the Capitol was being besieged by thousands of people intent on overturning it and stuck around to be able to confirm the results of the Electoral College. That's why you acknowledge the President.
All I've said is we should look into concerns that lots of voters have. I've never said that he didn't win. He's the President of the United States. But I said we should look into the concerns. I think that's just common sense.
Well, looking at concerns is fine. It's just the problem is
But you guys don't wanna do
after I
that.
don't know how many court cases we
We
never
asked for an
found any.
investigation. You guys said no. We asked for an investigation a week after the election. You guys said no.
Well, I'll tell you what, I mean, I'm frustrated by this, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your good work on this. I think the most dangerous threat to the United States right now after 2.5 centuries, I was with a group of students the other day. I said the most amazing thing that's happened, in my view, in America, although it was an amazing act of patriotism for George Washington to turn over the presidency after 2 terms. I think the greatest miracle of American democracy was John Adams turning over the keys to Thomas Jefferson the first time the Federalists lost an election, and there was no violence. No one contested it. No one came to the Capitol. No one did anything except accept the fact that that was the election results. What we see going on in state after state is not a willingness to accept elections. It's to try to reframe the electorate. It's to try to make sure that certain people don't vote or participate in elections. It is the most antithetical thing that has happened in this country in 2.5 centuries. My father had didn't preach too much, and he taught me a lot of lessons, mostly by example. But one thing he always used to say is, when you're a winner, be a good winner and don't gloat. And when you're a loser, you accept the consequences and you move on. And I think America should learn that when it's a level playing field and we go out and compete and we're going to compete and we're going to have difference of opinions, we should accept the outcome and be prepared to move on. And since that's clearly not happening in parts of this country, I'm going to support this. And frankly, I wish my friend John Lewis were here to see us do this, but time to move forward. With that, I yield.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Jordan wants to respond
well, I
to
just say-
something you said, so
well-
I'll let that, but
Sorry.
you will be able to respond to Mr.
Okay,
Jordan.
that's fine. No, that's fine. But he said move on. For 4 years, Democrats questioned the results of the 2016 election. As recently as October of 2020, Hillary Clinton said the election was stolen from her in 2016. But we're not allowed to say, we got some concerns we'd like to investigate. I mean, they can for 4 years question 2016.
All right,
We can't raise concerns for 4 minutes.
You made your point.
Holy
Mr. Morelli?
cow.
No, I would
Mr.
just,
Morelli?
look, I don't, I mean, aside from rhetoric, I mean, we weren't conducting audits around the country. I mean, come on, I think
No,
you
you rated
have to acknowledge that Americans accepted, whether they like the election of Donald Trump or not.
You got a Bob Mueller
I mean, there are a lot of
investigation
things,
that's
Okay.
$30 million.
That's enough.
I think there are a lot of things I don't like. I don't like when the
It's
Cardinals
just-
lose
it's
the
just
World
funny.
Series or don't make it to the playoffs, God forbid. I don't like it when a lot of things happen. I accept them.
You didn't accept
And
2016.
No, I did accept it, actually, Mr. Jordan. And I've never been on national TV suggesting that I shouldn't accept the results of any election,
I
whether I
haven't either.
agree with it or
I haven't
disagree with
either.
it. I'll yield
The
back.
gentleman's time, please. Mr. Desaulniers, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to associate myself with Mr. Morelli's comments and just add, I just agree that equivalency, I don't see at all with the proportionality, just my perspective. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Ross, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And since my home state of North Carolina was brought up, I think it's very important for me to explain my support for this bill and the need for this bill, given the events that have gone on in North Carolina. Well, we could say since Reconstruction, but certainly since Shelby. And I want to thank Mr. Raskin for pointing out that the Supreme Court invited this Congress in Shelby and in Brnovich to go back and look at the Voting Rights Act, which is exactly what we're doing today. But the minute the Shelby County decision came down, I was serving in the state legislature. The Republican majority passed what was called the monster voter suppression law, because it did not have to be pre-cleared for the first time since 1965. And attorneys used Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act to bring a lawsuit which struck down the monster voter suppression law because it targeted African Americans with almost surgical precision. So the monster voter suppression law did not go into place. And in North Carolina, there has been a history over decades and decades of keeping African Americans and other minorities from having their full right to vote through packing and cracking in redistricting, which is why we have the imperative of passing this bill before the full redistricting process takes place in this decade. We had a Voting Rights Act in 2010, 2011, that could prevent many of the injustices we saw then. But right now, we do not. And right now, the threat is grave. I have worked on these issues for decades in North Carolina as a civil rights lawyer and as a member of the state legislature. I have seen discrimination against racial minorities in the law, and I have seen it at polling places in my district on a regular basis. We need this law. We need it as soon as possible. I am thrilled that it is named for John Lewis, but I'm even more thrilled that it is going to impact the rights of our minority populations for decades to come. Mr. Chairman, I support the underlying bill, and I support the rule, and we can't pass it a moment too soon.